The cruelest thing about losing everything is watching the world pretend you never existed. Elliot Rayburn knew this truth better than most, as he sat on a park bench watching life move past him like he was already a ghost. At 72, this former architect carried his remaining possessions in a worn canvas bag. He'd built homes where families laughed around dinner tables, designed spaces where children took their first steps. Now he found shelter wherever kindness allowed, invisible to most who passed by. On this autumn afternoon in Riverside Park, he noticed a small girl sitting alone, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her shoelaces hung loose after cruel children had pushed her down, mocking her speech and appearance. The sight stirred something deep in Elliot's chest. He approached slowly and knelt before her with gentle movements. Without words, he began, tying her shoes with careful precision. What would happen when her mother, watching from a nearby car, realized this homeless stranger had shown her daughter more respect than anyone else that day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 23 years ago, Elliot Rayburn had stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a blueprint come to life. Half the skyline bore his signature, elegant towers that caught morning light, residential complexes where young couples started families, office buildings where dreams were born and businesses flourished. His firm, Rayburn Architecture, employed 67 people, and had a waiting list of clients stretching 18 months into the future. The architectural plans spread across his mahogany desk that morning showed his most ambitious project yet, a mixed-use development that would transform an entire city block. His daughter Sarah had called to congratulate him on the commission, her voice bright with pride. His wife Margaret had kissed him goodbye, reminding him about their anniversary dinner that evening. Life had felt solid then, built on foundations, as strong as the buildings he designed. The yellowed, water-damaged blueprints, now tucked deep in his canvas bag, told a different story. Coffee stains obscured the careful measurements. Rain had blurred the precise lines, but Elliot still remembered every dimension, every angle, every detail of structures that would never be built. The collapse hadn't happened overnight, like most architectural failures. It was a combination of factors, each seemingly manageable alone, catastrophic together. The 2008 financial crisis hit first, freezing construction loans and canceling projects. Then came the lawsuit from a previous development where foundation issues emerged years after completion. His insurance covered most of the settlement, but not the reputation damage. Clients grew nervous, projects were pulled, and his firm began hemorrhaging money. He'd mortgaged everything to keep his employees working, the office, his home, even Margaret's inheritance from her father. When it became clear the firm couldn't survive, he'd used his personal savings to pay severance packages, ensuring his people had something to land on. By the time the doors closed for the final time, Elliot had nothing left except his professional integrity and a mountain of debt. Margaret had tried to be supportive at first, but watching their comfortable life evaporate proved too much. The divorce papers came 6 months after the business closed. Sarah, caught between loyalty to both parents, had chosen her mother's stability over her father's uncertainty. The last conversation with his daughter still echoed in quiet moments, her voice strained, asking why he couldn't just start over somewhere else, why he had to be so stubborn about taking help, why he insisted on staying in a city that only reminded him of his failures. Now, 4 years later, Elliot understood that starting over at 68 wasn't like sketching a new design on a blank sheet of paper. The world had little use for aging architects with tarnished reputations and no capital. The few interviews he'd managed had ended with polite rejections and suggestions that he might consider transitioning into retirement. as if retirement was possible without savings, without a home, without the pension he'd cashed out to pay. His employees. The morning routine at Sacred Heart Shelter began at 5:30. Elliot usually woke before the alarm, a habit from decades of early construction site meetings that his body refused to forget. He'd fold his thin blanket with military precision, gather his few possessions, and join the quiet line of men shuffling toward the community bathroom. The morning ablutions were performed with the dignity each man could muster, washing with donated soap, shaving with disposable razors that cut more than they smoothed, brushing teeth over stainless steel sinks that had seen better decades. Marcus Williams occupied the cot next to Elliot's. The 60-year-old veteran had lost his leg to an IED in Iraq and his apartment to medical bills 2 years later. Unlike many of the shelter residents, Marcus retained an infectious optimism that seemed impossible given their circumstances. He'd appointed himself Elliot's unofficial guide to street life, sharing wisdom about which food banks had the shortest lines, which library branches stayed warmest in winter, and which police officers might actually listen if you needed help. Morning. "Professor," Marcus would say, using his nickname for Elliot. "Ready for another day in paradise?" Their friendship had formed slowly, built on shared silences more than conversation. Both men carried the weight of lives interrupted, of skills the world no longer seemed to need. Marcus had been a mechanic before his deployment, could fix anything with an engine, but employers balked at hiring someone who needed accommodation for his prosthetic. Together, they represented the invisible casualties of an economy that discarded experience like outdated technology. After breakfast, usually watery oatmeal and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous week, Elliot would walk to the central library. The building itself was one he'd always admired, designed in the 1920s with the kind of craftsmanship that modern construction rarely achieved. The limestone facade showed its age but maintained its dignity, much like Elliot himself hoped to. The library served as sanctuary, workplace, and social center all at once. Elliot would claim a corner table in the architecture section, surrounded by books that felt like visits with old friends. He'd spend hours studying new building techniques, reading about sustainable design, keeping his mind sharp even when his prospects seemed increasingly dim. The librarians had grown accustomed to his daily presence. Mrs. Chen would save the latest architectural magazines for him, and young David would slip him day-old pastries from the cafe with a conspiratorial wink. Other homeless individuals used the library too, but for different purposes. Some came for internet access to search for jobs or contact family. Others sought warmth and quiet sleep until security inevitably woke them. A few, like Elliot, treated it as their office, maintaining some semblance of professional routine. In lives that had lost most structure, the afternoons brought the hardest choices. Job applications yielded form letter rejections, if any response at all. Social services offered programs designed for younger men or those with different challenges. The hours between lunch and dinner stretched long, filled with the kind of idle time that could break a man's spirit if he let it. Elliot had learned to fill these hours with observation. He'd walk through the financial district, studying buildings he'd once competed to design, noting how the structures aged, how they interfaced with the changing city around them. Sometimes he'd sketch in a battered notebook, not grand designs anymore, but small improvements he noticed. A corner that gathered litter because of poor wind flow design, a plaza that could better serve pedestrians with different seating arrangements, an office building whose facade cleaned beautifully, but whose base showed water damage from inadequate drainage. These sketches served no practical purpose. No one would hire him to implement such observations, but they kept his professional eye sharp and reminded him that he still saw the built environment with an expert's understanding, even if the world no longer valued that expertise. Evening brought the return to Sacred Heart Shelter, where dinner was served promptly at 6. The meals were simple but adequate. donated food prepared by volunteers who approached their task with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skill. Elliot had learned to be grateful for consistency rather than quality, though he sometimes missed the elaborate dinners Margaret used to prepare for their anniversary celebrations. The shelter's common room became a different world after dinner. Some residents watched television, usually whatever channel seemed least likely to provoke arguments. Others played cards or chess with sets donated by local churches. A few would step outside to smoke, sharing cigarettes and stories in the gathering darkness. Elliot preferred to read during these evening hours. He'd found a collection of architectural magazines in a dumpster behind a firm that was moving offices: Professional Builder, Architectural Digest, Metropolis, publications that had once arrived monthly at his own office. The issues were several years old, but architecture evolved slowly enough that most of the content remained relevant. Reading these magazines created a strange temporal displacement. The projects featured had been under construction when his firm was thriving. He recognized many of the architects, had competed against some of them for major commissions. Their careers had continued upward while his had cratered, but their work still spoke to him in a language few others understood. The interplay of form and function, the way light moved through carefully planned spaces, the mathematics of load-bearing walls and cantilevers, these concepts remained as familiar as his own name. Marcus would sometimes join him, curious about whatever had captured Elliot's attention. The veteran couldn't read architectural drawings, but he appreciated craftsmanship in all its forms. He'd listen as Elliot explained why a particular building's design was elegant or flawed, how small decisions in the planning phase could affect how people moved through spaces decades later. "You talk about buildings like they're alive," Marcus observed one evening, watching Elliot trace the lines of a skyscraper's structural diagram with his finger. "In a way, they are," Elliot replied. "They age and change. They respond to weather, to use, to the neighborhoods that grow around them. Good architecture adapts, bad architecture fights against time and loses." The conversation had continued past lights out, conducted in whispers as other men settled into restless sleep around them. Architecture as living organism was a concept that had guided Elliot's entire career. The idea that buildings should enhance human life rather than simply containing it. Now, sitting on his weathered park bench in the autumn afternoon, watching families enjoy the green space he'd helped preserve during his time on the City Planning Commission, Elliot wondered if his own life had been well designed. The structures he'd created would outlast him by decades, sheltering and serving people he'd never meet. But the personal architecture of his existence, the relationships, the financial security, the social connections that supported a man's later years, had proven far more fragile than steel and concrete. The small girl's tears had stopped. She sat quietly now, occasionally glancing at her properly tied shoes, then looking around the park as if seeing it with new eyes. Children her age usually bounced back quickly from disappointment, but something in her stillness suggested deeper hurt. Elliot recognized the look, the careful composure of someone learning that the world could be cruel for reasons beyond their control or understanding. He'd seen that same expression in his own reflection during the worst months after his firm's collapse, the bewilderment of discovering that competence and good intentions offered no protection against forces larger than oneself, that a lifetime of building could be undone by market forces, legal complications, and the simple mathematics of insufficient capital. But he'd also learned that dignity, unlike financial security, was something no one could take away. It had to be surrendered voluntarily. Every morning, he chose to maintain his standards, to stay clean, to treat others with respect, to continue learning and growing despite circumstances that might justify despair. These small acts of self-preservation had kept him human when everything else fell away. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, and Elliot knew he'd need to start walking toward the shelter soon. Dinner waited, followed by another evening of reading outdated magazines and listening to Marcus's stories. Tomorrow would bring another day of job applications and library visits and the quiet dignity of survival. But for now, he sat on his bench, watching the little girl organize her thoughts and emotions with the careful precision of someone far older than her years. In her determined stillness, he recognized something familiar. The decision to endure, to maintain grace under pressure, to treat each day as an opportunity rather than a burden. Architecture had taught him that the strongest structures were built to bend without breaking. Perhaps the same principle applied to human lives. The sound of children's laughter had turned sharp and cruel, cutting through the peaceful afternoon like glass. Elliot looked up from his weathered copy of Architectural Review to see a group of 8 or 9-year-olds surrounding the bench where the little girl sat. Their backpacks and pristine sneakers marked them as students from Riverside Elementary, the prestigious private school 6 blocks east of the park. "Why do you talk so funny?" demanded a boy with carefully styled blonde hair and a polo shirt. That probably cost more than Elliot spent on food in a month. "Are you stupid or something?" The little girl, she couldn't have been more than 7, shrank back against the bench. Her dark skin seemed to make her an even easier target for their attention. She wore a simple yellow dress that had seen better days, but was clean and well-maintained, suggesting someone who cared for her despite limited means. "I'm not stupid," she said quietly, her words carrying the slight accent that had apparently provoked their mockery. "You just talk weird," interrupted a girl with elaborate braids secured by ribbons that matched her designer outfit. "My mom says people like you don't belong in our neighborhood." Elliot felt his chest tighten with familiar anger. He'd witnessed enough cruelty in his months on the street to recognize the particular viciousness children could display when they learned prejudice from their parents. But something about this girl's quiet dignity in the face of their taunts struck him as extraordinary. She wasn't crying yet, wasn't running away. She was trying to reason with them. "Please leave me alone," she said with remarkable composure. "I'm just waiting for my mom." "Your mom probably cleans houses," the blonde boy sneered. "My dad says that's all your people are good for." The words hung in the air like poison. Elliot watched the little girl's composure finally crack, her lower lip trembling as tears began to form. The children sensed weakness and moved closer, their circle tightening like predators around wounded prey. "Look, she's gonna cry," laughed another boy, this one wearing shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Gonna run home to mommy." That's when the girl stood up, trying to maintain her dignity, but her shoelaces had come undone during their harassment. As she took a step forward, she tripped, falling hard onto her knees on the concrete pathway. Her pink hair ribbon scattered across the ground as the children erupted in laughter. "She can't even walk right," the girl with the elaborate braids cackled. "Maybe she really is stupid." Elliot closed his magazine and set it carefully beside him. In his years of homelessness, he'd learned to avoid confrontations that might draw unwanted attention from authorities or create complications for his shelter placement. Street survival required invisibility, the ability to witness cruelty without intervening, to endure insults without responding. But watching this small child struggle to maintain her dignity while facing the same kind of casual brutality he encountered daily triggered something deeper than self-preservation. This wasn't just about bullying, it was about a fundamental choice between passive acceptance and active compassion. The girl was trying to retie her shoelaces while still on her knees, tears now streaming down her cheeks as the children continued their taunts. Her small fingers shook as she fumbled with the laces, unable to manage the simple task under such emotional duress. "Your shoes are as dirty as you are," one of the children said, their voice carrying the particular cruelty that came from learned prejudice rather than childish ignorance. Elliot stood up slowly, his joints protesting after hours on the hard bench. The children noticed his movement and fell silent, suddenly aware that an adult was paying attention to their behavior. Their momentary uncertainty gave him the opening he needed. He walked toward them with the measured pace of someone who had once commanded construction sites and boardroom meetings. Despite his worn clothing and weathered appearance, something in his bearing suggested authority that transcended circumstances. "I think it's time for you children to move along," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm firmness that brooked no argument. The blond boy started to protest, but Elliot's steady gaze made him reconsider. These were children accustomed to adult deference to their parents' wealth and status, but Elliot's look conveyed something they'd never encountered: complete indifference to their social advantages. "We weren't doing anything wrong," the girl, with braids, said defensively, though she was already backing away. "Of course not," Elliot replied, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her for a second. "But I'm sure your parents are expecting you home for dinner." The children exchanged uncertain glances. They'd been caught between worlds, old enough to understand their behavior was cruel, but young enough to lack the sophistication to justify it when challenged by someone who refused to be intimidated. "Come on," the blond boy said to his friends, trying to save face. "This place smells anyway." As they gathered their backpacks and walked away with exaggerated indifference, Elliot noticed their nervous glances over their shoulders. They weren't accustomed to being dismissed by someone they'd been taught to consider beneath their attention. Once they were out of sight, Elliot turned to the little girl, who was still on her knees trying to manage her shoelaces through her tears. He approached, slowly, the way he might approach a frightened animal, and knelt beside her on the concrete. "May I help you with those?" he asked gently. She looked up at him with wide, dark eyes that seemed far too old for her age. For a moment she seemed to weigh his offer, clearly having learned that not all adult attention was benevolent. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I can do it myself." "I'm sure you can," Elliot replied, settling more comfortably on his knees. "But sometimes it's nice to have help, even when we can manage alone." Something in his tone, respectful rather than patronizing, patient rather than hurried, seemed to reassure her. She nodded slightly, extending her foot so he could reach her shoelaces more easily. Elliot's hands, still steady despite months of uncertainty and poor nutrition, worked carefully with the tangled laces. He'd tied countless shoes for Sarah when she was small, and the muscle memory returned effortlessly. As he worked, he found himself speaking in the same gentle tone he'd once used with his daughter. "These are nice shoes," he said, noting that while they weren't expensive, they were well cared for and recently cleaned. "Someone takes good care of you." "My mama does," the girl said, her tears beginning to slow. "She works really hard." "I'm sure she does," Elliot replied, finishing the first shoe and moving to the second. "What's your name?" "Lila," she said, watching his careful work with fascination. "What's yours?" "I'm Elliot," he said, securing the final knot with a gentle tug to ensure it would hold. "There, those should stay tied for a while." Lila looked down at her properly secured shoes, then back at his weathered face. "Thank you, Mr. Elliot, you're very nice." The simple gratitude in her voice hit him harder than all the insults he'd endured in recent months. When had anyone last told him he was nice? When had his actions last mattered to someone, even in such a small way? "You're very welcome, Lila," he said, rising slowly to his feet. "And those children were wrong about you. There's nothing wrong with how you talk or how you look. They were just being mean because they don't know any better." She nodded solemnly, absorbing his words with the seriousness children brought to adult wisdom they recognized as genuine. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked hopefully. The question caught him off guard. Most of his interactions these days were transactional. "Thank you for not panhandling here. Thank you for keeping quiet in the library. Thank you for following the shelter rules." No one had expressed interest in seeing him again in months. "I might be," he said carefully, "but you should probably play closer to where your mother can see you." As if summoned by his words, a car door slammed in the nearby parking area. Lila's face brightened immediately. "That's her now," she said, waving toward a figure approaching through the trees. "Mama, over here!" Elliot glanced toward the parking area and saw a woman walking quickly toward them, her expression mixing relief at finding her daughter with concern about the stranger kneeling beside her. He recognized the protective urgency in her movement, the same instinct that had driven him to help. Not wanting to cause any concern or complicate what had been a simple act of kindness, Elliot collected his magazine and canvas bag. "Take care of yourself, Lila," he said quietly. As he walked away toward the park's main path, he heard Lila calling after him, "Bye, Mr. Elliot. Thank you for my shoes." He raised his hand in a small wave without turning around, not wanting to seem threatening to the approaching mother. Behind him, he could hear Lila's excited voice explaining about the nice man who had helped her, but he kept walking, letting the distance grow between them. What Elliot didn't know was that Miranda Hargrove had been sitting in her Mercedes in the parking area for the past 10 minutes, watching the entire encounter unfold through her windshield. She'd seen her daughter's distress, witnessed the children's cruelty, and watched this homeless stranger intervene with a gentleness that had moved her to tears. Now, as Lila ran toward her with properly tied shoes and a story about kindness from a stranger, Miranda found herself looking back toward the park path where the man had disappeared, wondering who he was and how she might find him again. Miranda Hargrove had built her empire on the principle that every problem had a solution. You just had to be willing to work harder and think more creatively than your competition. As the founder and CEO of Hargrove Technologies, she transformed a small software consulting firm into a billion-dollar enterprise specializing in artificial intelligence solutions for healthcare systems. Her business cards, printed on thick cardstock with raised lettering, filled a leather portfolio that traveled with her everywhere, tangible proof of the network she'd cultivated over 15 years of 18-hour workdays and relentless ambition. But sitting in her Mercedes, after watching a homeless stranger show her daughter more genuine kindness than anyone at Lila's expensive private school had managed in 3 months, Miranda realized that her vast collection of professional contacts seemed utterly useless for the task ahead. "Mama, why were those kids so mean?" Lila asked from her car seat as Miranda drove slowly through the evening traffic, her mind still processing what she'd witnessed. The question hung between them like a challenge. How do you explain systemic racism and childhood cruelty to a 7-year-old who just experienced both? How do you prepare your child for a world that would judge her before knowing her without destroying her natural trust in human goodness? "Some children learn to say hurtful things from adults who should know better," Miranda finally said, choosing her words carefully. "It doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean anything they said was true. The nice man said the same thing," Lila replied, kicking her properly tied shoes against her car seat. "He was very gentle, like when Grandpa used to tie my shoes." Miranda's chest tightened at the mention of her father, who died 2 years earlier. Dr. James Hargrove had been the kind of man who noticed when children needed help, who spoke to everyone with the same respectful tone, regardless of their circumstances. He taught Miranda that true strength came from lifting others up, not standing on their shoulders. "Tell me more about the nice man," Miranda said, pulling into their driveway, a circular path leading to a contemporary house that had graced the cover of Architectural Digest 3 years earlier. As Lila chatted about Mr. Elliot and his careful attention to her shoelaces, Miranda found herself remembering her father's lessons about dignity and compassion. She'd been so focused on building security for herself and her daughter that she'd perhaps forgotten the values that had motivated her initial success. Miranda had grown up in East Cleveland, the daughter of a family doctor who treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. She'd watched her father extend the same courtesy to welfare mothers and corporate executives, had seen him spend extra time explaining diagnoses to families who spoke English as a second language. His practice had never made them wealthy, but it had made their community stronger. Her transformation from small-town doctor's daughter to tech billionaire had required sacrificing some of that inclusive worldview. The venture capital world rewarded ruthless efficiency, not social consciousness. She'd learned to speak in metrics and projections, to see human problems as market opportunities, to measure success in stock valuations rather than lives improved. But watching that homeless man kneel on concrete to help her daughter had reminded her of something essential about who she'd once hoped to become. "Did Mr. Elliot seem hungry, baby?" Miranda asked as they entered their house, 4,000 square feet of carefully curated modern design that felt too large for two people most evenings. "I don't know," Lila replied, settling at the kitchen island where her homework waited. "He was very thin, and his clothes looked old." Miranda nodded, pulling ingredients from their restaurant-quality refrigerator while her mind worked through the implications. A homeless man had shown her daughter more respect and kindness than the children at a school that cost $30,000 per year in tuition. The irony wasn't lost on her. That evening, after Lila's bath and bedtime story, Miranda sat in her home office, surrounded by the monitors and ergonomic furniture that supported her digital empire. But instead of reviewing quarterly projections or attending video conferences with international partners, she found herself opening search engines and typing variations of homeless services, Riverside Park, and how to find someone without a last name. The search results painted a sobering picture of the city's homeless population, estimated at over 8,000 individuals, scattered across dozens of shelters, encampments, and abandoned buildings. The logistics of locating one specific person among that population seemed almost impossible, especially someone who might have good reasons for avoiding official attention. Miranda's approach to complex problems had always been systematic. She created spreadsheets listing every homeless shelter within a 10-mile radius of Riverside Park. She researched soup kitchens, food banks, and social service organizations. She even looked into hiring a private investigator, though something about that option felt wrong, too much like surveillance of someone whose privacy she should respect. Over the following days, she found herself driving different routes to and from work, always passing through or near Riverside Park. She'd bought coffee for every homeless individual she encountered, struck up conversations with people who might know someone named Elliot, left her business card with shelter administrators, who promised to pass along messages to anyone fitting his description. The business cards had never felt more inadequate. What good were connections to venture capitalists and technology leaders when you needed to navigate an entirely different world? One defined by invisible rules and informal networks that existed beyond her carefully constructed professional sphere. "You've been distracted lately," observed Janet Chen, Miranda's longtime assistant, during their weekly planning meeting. "Everything okay?" Miranda looked up from her laptop screen, where she'd been studying the website for Sacred Heart Shelter. Instead of reviewing the agenda for Thursday's board meeting, Janet had worked with her for 8 years, long enough to recognize when her focus was divided. "Just some personal business," Miranda replied, closing the browser tab with reluctance. "Nothing that affects our operations." But that wasn't entirely true. For the first time in years, Miranda found herself questioning the allocation of her time and resources. She employed over 1,200 people, managed investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and influenced decisions that affected healthcare delivery for millions of patients. Yet none of that expertise seemed relevant to the simple goal of expressing gratitude to a man who'd shown her daughter basic human decency. The disconnect between her professional capabilities and personal limitations felt profound and unsettling. "Have you ever tried to find someone without knowing their last name or address?" Miranda asked Janet during a quiet moment between conference calls. "Like an old friend from school?" Janet replied, looking up from her tablet where she was scheduling Miranda's upcoming trip to the West Coast. "Social media usually works for that. Someone who probably isn't on social media," Miranda clarified. "Someone who might not have a permanent address." Janet's expression shifted, recognizing that this wasn't idle curiosity. That's much harder. Missing persons databases, maybe, or hiring a professional investigator. Why? Miranda considered how much to explain, then decided on a simplified version. Someone helped Lila when she was upset. I'd like to thank them properly. Ah, Janet said, her tone suggesting she understood there was more to the story. Have you tried going back to wherever it happened? Sometimes people have routines. The suggestion was so obvious that Miranda felt foolish for not thinking of it sooner. Of course! If Elliot spent time in Riverside Park regularly, the most logical approach was simply to return there consistently until their paths crossed again. That afternoon, instead of working late in her office as usual, Miranda picked up Lila from her after-school program and drove to the park. They walked the same paths Lila had explored the previous week, sat on benches with good views of the surrounding area, and fed ducks at the small pond, while Miranda's eyes scanned every corner of the green space. Are we looking for Mr. Elliot? Lila asked with the directness that children brought to adult subterfuge. I'd like to thank him for being so kind to you, Miranda admitted. Do you remember exactly where you met him? Lila led her to the bench where she'd sat crying, now occupied by a different homeless man who dozed in the afternoon sun. Miranda approached carefully, not wanting to disturb him, but hoping he might know something about the area's regular visitors. Excuse. Me, she said gently. I'm looking for someone who might spend time here, an older gentleman named Elliot. The man opened his eyes slowly, taking in Miranda's expensive clothes and uncertain demeanor with practiced assessment. Lady, there's dozens of folks come through here. What's he look like? Miranda realized she had only Lila's description to work with. Thin, grey-haired, gentle hands, kind eyes, details that could apply to many men in their 70s struggling with homelessness. He helped my daughter last week, she explained. I just want to say thank you. The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward the eastern edge of the park. Try the library on 5th Street. Lot of the regulars spend time there during the day. Librarians might know your fellow better than I do. As Miranda thanked him and prepared to leave, he called after her. Hey, lady, if you do find him, maybe don't mention you've been asking around. Some folks value their privacy, you know. The comment stayed with her as she and Lila walked back to their car. In her eagerness to express gratitude, was she invading someone's carefully maintained anonymity? Did Elliot have reasons for remaining difficult to find that went beyond simple homelessness? Elliot's worn canvas bag contained everything that remained of his former life. A photograph of Sarah at her high school graduation, his drafting compass and ruler from architecture school, 3 changes of clothes donated by various charities, a bar of soap wrapped in a washcloth, and the water-damaged blueprints from his final project. The bag itself had been a gift from Margaret 20 years ago, purchased for a camping trip they'd never taken. Now it served as portable home, office, and memory keeper all in one. He'd grown attached to its predictable weight on his shoulder, the way its familiar bulk made him feel less vulnerable in crowds. Other homeless individuals carried plastic, bags that tore easily, or backpacks that marked them as transient. The canvas bag looked like it might belong to a professor or artist, someone with purpose beyond mere survival. 3 days had passed since his encounter with little Lila in the park, but Elliot found himself thinking about her often. Her polite gratitude and the way she'd called him Mr. Elliot had stirred memories of when respect came naturally from children who saw him as a successful adult, worthy of admiration. He wondered if she was sleeping better now, if the bullies had left her alone, if her mother had found ways to help her process the cruelty she'd experienced. The morning routine at Sacred Heart Shelter proceeded with its usual efficiency. Elliot rose at 5:20, 5 minutes before the official wake-up call, and completed his ablutions with the same methodical care he'd once brought to reviewing construction plans. Clean-shaven and properly groomed, he could pass for an eccentric professor rather than a homeless man, a distinction that had practical value in a world that judged character by appearance. "You're looking thoughtful this morning, Professor," Marcus observed as they walked toward the breakfast line. The veteran moved with the careful gait of someone whose prosthetic leg required conscious attention to each step, but his spirits remained consistently higher than circumstances seemed to warrant. "Just remembering something pleasant," Elliot replied, not yet ready to share the story of tying a little girl's shoelaces. The memory felt too precious to expose to analysis or commentary. Breakfast was oatmeal again, flavored with cinnamon that didn't quite mask its institutional blandness. Elliot ate mechanically while listening to the conversations around him. Updates about job interviews that hadn't materialized into offers, complaints about new shelter regulations, gossip about which food banks had the best offerings on which days of the week. The social dynamics of homelessness had taken months for Elliot to understand. Unlike the business world's hierarchies based on wealth and position, street society organized itself around different currencies: information, survival, skills, connections to resources, and the ability to navigate bureaucratic systems without triggering negative attention. Marcus ranked highly in this alternative economy, his military experience and natural leadership making him a trusted advisor to newer residents struggling with adaptation. After breakfast, Elliot walked his usual route to the central library, passing through neighborhoods that showcased the city's economic extremes. Luxury condominiums stood within 6 blocks of abandoned buildings. Artisanal coffee shops charged more for a single drink than most shelter residents spent on food in a day. The contrasts no longer surprised him, but they remained sobering reminders of how quickly circumstances could change. The library had become his anchor, the one place where his former identity as an educated professional still held some value. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, had grown accustomed to his daily presence and treated him with the same courtesy she extended to university researchers and graduate students. Her respect wasn't charity, it was recognition of his genuine knowledge and careful treatment of the materials he consulted. His corner table in the architecture section had become unofficial territory. Other patrons seemed to understand that the weathered man with the careful posture and thoughtful demeanor belonged there, surrounded by books about sustainable design and urban planning theories. He'd become part of the library's ecosystem, as familiar as the reading chairs and periodical displays. This morning, Elliot settled into his usual routine with architectural records spread before him, but his concentration kept drifting. The magazine featured a project by Hammond and Associates, a firm he'd competed against regularly during his successful years. Their latest commission was a mixed-use development that bore striking similarities to the project that had been cancelled when his firm collapsed, proof that good ideas rarely died. They simply waited for different architects with better timing. "Excuse me," said a voice behind him. "Are you interested in architecture professionally or just as a hobby?" Elliot turned to see David, the young librarian who sometimes brought him pastries from the cafe. The 20-something had the earnest curiosity of someone still discovering his intellectual passions, and he'd been watching Elliot's daily study sessions with growing intrigue. "I used to practice architecture," Elliot replied carefully. "Now I just try to stay current with the field." "That's fascinating," David said, settling into the adjacent chair. "I've always been curious about how buildings affect the way people behave, like why some spaces feel welcoming and others feel hostile." The question opened a door Elliot hadn't realized he'd been hoping someone would knock on. For the next hour, he found himself explaining the psychology of architectural design, how ceiling heights influenced creativity, how natural light affected mood, how the placement of doorways could encourage or discourage social interaction. David listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that demonstrated real engagement with the concepts. When their conversation finally wound down, the young librarian looked at Elliot with new respect. "You should consider teaching," David said. "The community college offers continuing education programs for adults." They're always looking for instructors with practical experience. The suggestion planted a seed that Elliot carried with him as he left the library that afternoon. Teaching had never been part of his career plans, but sharing knowledge felt natural and satisfying in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Perhaps there were opportunities he hadn't considered, ways to contribute that didn't require the capital and connections he'd lost. His afternoon walk took him through Riverside Park, partly from habit and partly from hope. He told himself he wasn't specifically looking for Lila, but he couldn't deny the disappointment he felt when his usual bench remained empty of small girls with untied shoelaces. Instead, he found Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who fed stray cats and often shared her bench with anyone who needed a place to rest. She'd been coming to the park for 30 years, had watched the neighborhood change from working-class families to young professionals to its current mix of wealth and displacement. "You're the fellow who helped that little girl last week," she said as Elliot settled beside her. "I saw what happened with those awful children." Elliot was surprised that his intervention had been noticed. He'd assumed the encounter was private, witnessed only by Lila and her hidden mother. "She seemed like a sweet child," he replied. "No one should have to endure that kind of treatment. Her mother's been coming back every day since then," Mrs. Patterson continued, scattering breadcrumbs for the gathering pigeons. "Driving a fancy car, walking around like she's looking for someone. I figure she's looking for you." The information created a complex mix of emotions in Elliot's chest. Gratitude that someone cared enough to seek him out, but also anxiety about what such contact might entail. His experience with wealthy people during his business years had taught him that their gratitude often came with expectations or complications he wasn't equipped to handle in his current circumstances. "What kind of fancy car?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "One of those expensive German ones, silver. The woman's well-dressed, carries herself like she's used to being in charge of things, but she seems genuinely concerned, not just going through the motions." Elliot absorbed this information while watching the pigeons compete for crumbs. Part of him wanted to time his park visits to avoid the searching woman, to preserve the simple purity of his interaction with Lila. But another part was curious about what kind of person raised such a polite, resilient child, despite the obvious privilege that expensive car represented. "If you see her again," he said finally, "you could mention that the fellow who helped her daughter comes to the library most afternoons. No pressure, just information." Mrs. Patterson nodded with understanding. "Sometimes it's easier to meet on neutral ground." As evening approached, Elliot made his way back towards Sacred Heart Shelter, his mind processing the day's interactions. David's suggestion about teaching had awakened possibilities he'd thought were permanently closed. Mrs. Patterson's news about Lila's mother searching for him created both opportunity and uncertainty. At dinner, Marcus noticed his thoughtful mood. "You've got that look again, Professor. Something brewing in that architect brain of yours?" Elliot considered how much to share, then decided that Marcus had earned the right to his confidence. Over bowls of donated chili and day-old rolls, he told the story of Lila, the bullies, and his simple intervention. Marcus listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as the story unfolded. When Elliot finished, the veteran sat quietly for a moment before responding. "You know what that was?" Marcus said finally. "That was you being yourself again, not the homeless version of yourself, not the struggling version, just the decent man you've always been, responding to someone who needed help." The observation hit Elliot with unexpected force. In focusing so intently on everything he'd lost, he'd perhaps overlooked what remained unchanged: his values, his instincts, his capacity for compassion. These qualities existed independently of his financial situation or professional status. "The mother's looking for me," Elliot said. "I'm not sure what she wants. Maybe she just wants to say thank you," Marcus replied. "Or maybe she wants to help. Either way, it's your choice whether to make contact, but don't let pride make the decision for you." That night, lying on his narrow cot, while other men snored and shifted around him, Elliot stared at the ceiling and wondered what tomorrow might bring. For months, his days had followed predictable patterns designed to minimize risk and maximize survival. But Lila's appearance in his life had introduced variables he couldn't control or predict. Change, he realized, might be approaching whether he was ready for it or not. The question was whether he had the courage to meet it with the same dignity he'd tried to maintain through his worst moments. Miranda had never realized how invisible homeless people could be until she started actively looking for one. The city was full of men who might match Elliot's general description: thin, gray-haired, carrying worn bags, avoiding eye contact with passers-by. But none of them responded to the name Elliot, and most seemed uncomfortable with her questions, as if her inquiries represented some form of threat to their carefully maintained anonymity. The homeless shelter registry book at Sacred Heart represented her best lead yet, though the administrator's protective attitude toward his residents made access challenging. Brother Francis was a Franciscan monk who'd spent 15 years working with the city's homeless population, and he regarded Miranda's expensive clothing and determined demeanor with barely concealed suspicion. "I appreciate your desire to express gratitude," he said, sitting across from her in an office that managed to be both Spartan and warm. "But our residents have a right to privacy. Many of them have good reasons for preferring to remain difficult to locate." Miranda shifted uncomfortably in the donated office chair, aware that her presence in this environment marked her as an outsider in ways that went beyond simple economic differences. The shelter's common room, visible through Brother Francis's window, housed men whose lives had been shaped by forces she could barely comprehend: mental illness, addiction, economic collapse, family breakdown, medical bankruptcy, her own struggles. With work-life balance suddenly seemed trivial by comparison. "I understand the need for privacy," she replied carefully. "I'm not asking for personal information or addresses. I just want to leave a message for someone named Elliot, who helped my daughter. If he's not interested in contact, that's perfectly acceptable." Brother Francis studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing competing obligations. His responsibility to protect his residents' privacy battled against his recognition that Miranda's intentions seemed genuinely benevolent. "What did this Elliot do for your daughter?" he asked finally. Miranda described the park encounter, watching the monk's expression soften as she explained how gently Elliot had tied Lila's shoelaces after the bullying incident. Brother Francis had seen enough cruelty toward vulnerable people to appreciate genuine kindness when he heard about it. "I can't confirm whether anyone by that name stays here," he said slowly, "but I can tell you that if someone wanted to leave a general message for residents to see, our bulletin board serves that purpose. No names, no pressure, just information, available to anyone who might be interested." The compromise felt imperfect but respectful. Miranda wrote a careful note explaining that Lila's mother wanted to thank the kind gentleman who'd helped her daughter in Riverside Park, and that she could be found most afternoons at the Central Library if he was interested in conversation. She included her first name only, avoiding the business cards that might intimidate or suggest obligations beyond simple gratitude. The library suggestion had come from Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd become Miranda's unofficial intelligence source during her daily park visits. The cat-feeding grandmother seemed to know everyone who regularly used the green space, and she'd mentioned seeing Elliot there almost daily during afternoon hours. Miranda's first visit to the Central Library's architecture section felt like entering a foreign country. She'd spent countless hours in corporate research facilities and university libraries during her graduate studies, but those environments had been focused on technology and business strategy. The architecture section attracted a different crowd: students sketching building facades, elderly men studying urban planning textbooks, young professionals researching sustainable design techniques. She positioned herself at a table with good sightlines to the entire section. ostensibly reading a magazine about healthcare technology while actually scanning every person who entered the area. Her surveillance felt awkward and intrusive, but she couldn't think of a better approach that didn't involve hiring investigators or making official inquiries that might violate Elliot's privacy. On her third library visit, she noticed a thin, grey-haired man settling at a corner table with architectural magazines and a worn notebook. His posture suggested education and professional background, even though his clothes were clearly second-hand, and his overall appearance indicated economic hardship. When he began sketching in his notebook with practiced precision, Miranda felt fairly certain she'd found her target, but approaching him presented complications she hadn't anticipated. What if she was wrong about his identity? What if he was the right person, but didn't want contact with Lila's wealthy mother? What if her gratitude felt patronizing or created uncomfortable obligations? She spent an hour watching him work, noting the careful attention he paid to architectural details in the magazines, the way younger library patrons seemed to respect. His presence in the section, the gentle manner in which he treated the reading materials. Everything about his behavior suggested someone who belonged in academic environments, who possessed expertise that transcended his current circumstances. When he finally packed up his materials and prepared to leave, Miranda faced a moment of decision. She could follow him, try to engage in conversation, or let another opportunity slip away, while she overthought the approach. "Excuse me," she said, approaching his table as he shouldered his canvas bag. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you Elliot?" He froze at the sound of his name, his expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and resignation. For a moment, they studied each other. The successful businesswoman and the homeless architect, separated by economic circumstances but united by their connection to one small girl's moment of need. "Yes," he said finally, his voice carrying the careful courtesy of someone who'd learned to navigate unexpected social interactions with defensive politeness. "And you would be Lila's mother." The recognition in his voice confirmed what Miranda had hoped and feared, that he remembered the encounter, that he'd perhaps been wondering about the aftermath, that this meeting was as significant for him as it had been for her family. "Miranda," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that felt both natural and completely inadequate given the circumstances. "I've been hoping to find you." He shook her hand briefly, his grip firm despite his thin appearance, his eyes never quite meeting hers as he processed whatever implications her presence might carry. "How is Lila?" he asked, and the genuine concern in his voice made Miranda's chest tighten with emotion she hadn't expected. "She's better," Miranda replied. "Thanks to you. She talks about the nice man who fixed her shoes almost every day. She wanted me to find you and say thank you properly." The mention of Lila's continued thoughts about their encounter seemed to relax some of the tension in Elliot's posture. Children's gratitude was apparently easier for him to accept than adult appreciation might be. "She's a lovely child," he said, "very brave. I hope those other children have left her alone." "They have," Miranda confirmed, "but I think your kindness meant more to her than just getting away from bullies. She learned something about how people can treat each other with dignity, even when they're strangers." The comment seemed to surprise him, as if the idea that his simple gesture might have educational value hadn't occurred to him. Miranda realized that in his focus on basic survival, he might have forgotten how much wisdom he still possessed, how much his example could matter to someone young enough to learn from it. "Would you like to get coffee?" she asked, gesturing toward the library's small cafe. "I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on architecture if you're willing to share them. Lila mentioned you were very knowledgeable." The invitation hung between them, like a bridge across the economic and social divide that separated their circumstances. Miranda held her breath, hoping she'd struck the right balance between gratitude and genuine interest, respect and curiosity. Elliot's library card had cost him $5 he could barely afford, but it represented something more valuable than its nominal fee suggested. Proof that he still belonged somewhere, that he retained access to knowledge and learning despite his circumstances. The small plastic rectangle, worn smooth from daily use, had become a talisman of sorts, evidence that his intellectual life could survive even when his professional and personal lives had crumbled. He'd been using the card to check out architectural texts for 3 months now, slowly working through the library's impressive collection of books on sustainable design, urban planning, and construction technology. The reading kept his mind sharp and his knowledge current, even though he had no immediate prospects for applying what he learned. The afternoon conversation with Miranda had left him feeling unsettled in ways he was still processing. Her genuine interest in his architectural knowledge had awakened something he'd thought was permanently dormant, the pleasure of sharing expertise with someone who appreciated its value. But her wealth and obvious success also highlighted the vast distance his life had traveled from professional respectability to social invisibility. "You look like someone wrestling with a decision," Marcus observed as they walked back to Sacred. Heart shelter together, the veteran had been waiting outside the library when Elliot emerged, claiming coincidence but clearly concerned about his friend's extended absence from their usual afternoon routine. "I met someone today," Elliot said carefully, "the mother of the little girl I helped last week." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The wealthy lady who's been asking around about you. You knew about that?" Elliot was surprised, though he realized he shouldn't have been. The homeless community had its own communication networks, informal but remarkably efficient when it came to information that might affect someone's safety or well-being. "Word gets around," Marcus replied, "especially when someone with expensive clothes starts visiting shelters and asking questions. People were looking out for you, making sure her intentions seemed legitimate before anyone said anything." The protective concern of people who had virtually nothing themselves touched Elliot more than he expected. During his successful years, professional relationships had often been transactional, based on mutual benefit and shared interests, but the solidarity he'd discovered among the homeless possessed a purity that business connections rarely achieved. "She wants to express gratitude," Elliot explained. "Invited me for coffee to discuss architecture. Nothing complicated, just conversation between adults who happen to share an interest in the built environment." "And you're worried about what?" "Exactly?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Elliot considered how to articulate concerns that felt both rational and ridiculous. "I'm worried about charity disguised as friendship, about pity masquerading as respect, about getting my hopes up for connections that can't realistically exist." Given our different circumstances, they walked in comfortable silence for several blocks, each man lost in his own thoughts. Marcus had his own experience with well-meaning civilians who wanted to support the troops in ways that felt more about their own need to feel virtuous than about genuine understanding or assistance. "You know what I learned in the army?" Marcus said finally. "Sometimes you have to trust your initial assessment of a situation and stop overthinking it. Your gut told you to help her daughter. Your gut is probably giving you decent information about the mother too." The advice resonated with Elliot's own instincts about Miranda. Her approach had been respectful, her interest in his knowledge seemed genuine, and her concern for Lila's well-being was obviously authentic. But years of economic struggle had taught him to be wary of situations that seemed too good to be true. That evening, as he sat in the shelter's common room with a book about green building techniques, Elliot found his attention drifting to memories of animated conversations about architecture he'd enjoyed during his professional years. The technical debates with colleagues, the creative problem-solving sessions with clients, the satisfaction of explaining complex design concepts to people who genuinely wanted to understand them. Miranda's questions about how buildings affected human behavior had reminded him why he'd been drawn to architecture in the first place. the fascinating intersection of art, science, psychology, and social responsibility that good design required. Her curiosity had felt authentic, not like the polite interest wealthy people sometimes displayed to demonstrate their cultural sophistication. "Professor's got that thinking look again," commented Ray, a fellow shelter resident who'd been watching Elliot stare at the same page for 20 minutes. "Something good brewing, or something troubling?" Ray was a former construction foreman whose back injury had ended his career and led to a cascade of financial and personal problems. He'd been at Sacred Heart longer than most residents, serving as an informal counselor for newcomers struggling with adaptation to their changed circumstances. "Just considering some possibilities," Elliot replied. "Someone showed interest in my professional knowledge today. First time in months." "That's good news, right?" Ray said, settling into an adjacent chair. "Unless you're talking yourself out of it for some reason." The comment struck closer to the truth than Elliot was comfortable acknowledging. He had been constructing elaborate scenarios for why accepting Miranda's invitation might be problematic, creating obstacles that might not actually exist. "She's very wealthy," Elliot said. "I'm concerned about the power imbalance, about what obligations might be implied by accepting her hospitality." Ray studied him with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd learned to read people accurately during his years managing construction crews. "You know what your real concern is," Ray said. "You're worried about hope, about letting yourself believe that your knowledge still has value, that you might still have something meaningful to contribute. Because if you're wrong about that, it'll hurt worse than just accepting that your useful life is over." The observation hit Elliot like a physical blow, accurate enough to be painful. He had been protecting himself from disappointment by assuming the worst about Miranda's motivations, by dismissing the possibility that genuine professional respect could exist across their economic divide. "Maybe," he admitted quietly. "Here's the thing about hope," Ray continued. "It's dangerous, but so is giving up on it entirely. Sometimes you have to risk getting hurt if you want any chance of things getting better." Later that evening, lying on his narrow cot, while the sounds of 40 other men settling in for sleep surrounded him, Elliot made his decision. Tomorrow, he would return to the library and look for Miranda. If she was still interested in conversation about architecture, he would accept her invitation and try to approach their interaction with the same openness he'd shown when helping Leela. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. For months, his emotional energy had been focused on damage control, maintaining dignity while managing the daily challenges of homelessness, preserving his sense of self while adapting to circumstances that threatened to erase his identity entirely. But Lila's simple gratitude and Miranda's genuine interest in his expertise suggested that he might still have gifts worth sharing, knowledge worth preserving, perspectives that could benefit others even if they couldn't immediately benefit himself. As he drifted toward sleep, Elliot found himself remembering the satisfaction he'd felt when explaining architectural concepts to David, the young librarian, whose curiosity had reminded him of his former students during guest lectures at the university. The memory carried a warmth that had been absent from his life for too long. The pleasure of teaching, of sharing accumulated wisdom with someone eager to learn. Perhaps it was time to stop protecting himself from hope and start exploring what possibilities might still exist for a 72-year-old architect, whose circumstances had changed, but whose knowledge remained intact. Miranda's search had begun as a simple quest to thank a kind stranger, but it had evolved into something resembling detective work. Her assistant Janet had helped her compile newspaper archives from the past 5 years, looking for any mention of prominent architects who'd experienced financial difficulties. The old newspaper clipping they finally located told a story that made Miranda's chest tighten with recognition and regret. The headline read, "Rayburn Architecture Closes After 30 Years, Citing Economic Pressures." The article, dated 4 years, earlier described the collapse of one of the city's most respected architectural firms. Elliot Rayburn, the founder and principal architect, was quoted expressing regret for the impact on his employees and clients, though he declined to provide details about the financial circumstances that had forced the closure. What struck Miranda most forcefully was the photograph accompanying the article, a professionally shot portrait of Elliot in better times, wearing a tailored suit and standing in front of a model of what was clearly a significant commercial development. His face showed the confident bearing of someone accustomed to success, but his eyes held the same gentle intelligence she'd recognized. In their library encounter, Jesus, she whispered, studying the image on her laptop screen. The transformation from successful professional to homeless man represented a fall that was both shocking and heartbreakingly common in an economy where financial security could evaporate with devastating speed. But the truly stunning revelation came in the article's fourth paragraph, where it mentioned several of Rayburn Architecture's notable projects over the years. Among them was the Meridian office complex on 5th Street, a 12-story building that Miranda knew intimately because she'd spent the first 3 years of her company's existence in a small suite on the 8th floor. The irony was so profound, it felt like cosmic intervention. The homeless man who'd shown such kindness to her daughter was the same architect who designed the building where she'd struggled to establish her business, working 18-hour days in a cramped office while her software company slowly gained traction. She'd spent countless hours in that building, riding its elevators, walking its corridors, using conference rooms that Elliot had planned with careful attention to natural light and traffic flow. Miranda remembered the building's details now with new understanding. The way morning sunlight streamed through strategically placed windows, creating warmth without glare. The intuitive wayfinding that made navigation easy even for first-time visitors. The small outdoor terraces that provided breathing space for stressed entrepreneurs like herself. These hadn't been accidents of construction, they were deliberate design choices by an architect who understood how built environments could support human productivity and well-being. The building, where she'd learned to be a CEO, had been designed by the man who was now living in a homeless shelter. Janet found her staring at the screen with tears in her eyes. The newspaper article still open beside architectural portfolio pages that showcased Elliot's impressive career. Awards from professional organizations, photographs of completed projects ranging from residential developments to institutional buildings, testimonials from satisfied clients who praised his attention to both aesthetic beauty and practical functionality. "This is him," Miranda said quietly. "The man who helped Lila. He designed the Meridian building." Janet pulled up a chair to study the articles and photographs. As Miranda's longtime assistant, she knew the significance of the Meridian building in their company's history, the place where Hargrove Technologies had been born, where the foundational code for their healthcare AI systems had been written during those early years of financial uncertainty and relentless determination. "My God," Janet murmured. "He was successful, really successful. What happened to him?" Further research revealed the full scope of the tragedy. Elliot Rayburn had been respected not just for his architectural skill, but for his integrity and treatment of employees. When his firm faced financial collapse during the economic downturn, he'd mortgaged his personal assets to pay severance packages for his staff. He'd honored all existing contracts, even when clients delayed payments. He'd maintained the highest professional standards even as his business disintegrated. Around him, the man living in a homeless shelter was the same person who'd sacrificed his own financial security to protect his employees from the worst effects of his firm's closure. He'd chosen honor over self-preservation, dignity over survival, professional responsibility over personal welfare. Miranda understood now why he'd approached Lila with such gentleness, why his manner had suggested someone accustomed to treating others with respect, regardless of their circumstances. Those weren't qualities he'd learned on the street. They were character traits that had guided his entire career and had ultimately contributed to his current predicament. The revelation recontextualized everything about their library encounter. His careful attention to architectural magazines, his obvious expertise when discussing building design, his dignity despite obvious economic hardship. These weren't surprising qualities in a homeless person who'd managed to retain his intellectual curiosity. They were the natural behavior of a distinguished professional whose circumstances had changed, but whose fundamental nature remained intact. Miranda spent the rest of the afternoon reading everything she could find about Elliot's career and the collapse of his firm. Trade publications had covered the story with the kind of respectful sadness reserved for the fall of genuinely respected figures. His peers had praised his contributions to the profession while lamenting the economic forces that had ended his career. But nowhere in the coverage did she find any suggestion that Elliot had made serious mistakes or engaged in unethical behavior. His firm had failed because of external pressures and his own unwillingness to compromise on payments to employees or quality of service to clients. He'd been destroyed by his virtue, not his vice. The knowledge created a profound shift in how Miranda understood their situation. This wasn't a case of a wealthy person offering charity to someone who'd never experienced success. This was a conversation between two professionals who'd both built something significant from nothing, though only one of them had managed to preserve their achievements through economic turbulence. More than that, it was a connection between two people whose lives had been intertwined without their knowledge. The building that had sheltered her during her company's vulnerable early years had been designed by someone who now lacked shelter of his own. The spaces where she dreamed of business success had been planned by an architect whose own dreams had been shattered by forces beyond his control. That evening, Miranda sat in her home office, a room designed according to principles she now realized Elliot had pioneered in the Meridian building, and composed a careful email to Brother Francis at Sacred Heart Shelter. She explained that she'd learned the identity of the man who'd helped her daughter and understood now why privacy had been so important. She asked if there was a way to convey information about their shared professional connection without violating the boundaries he'd established. The response came within 2 hours, suggesting that Brother Francis had been waiting for exactly this kind of development. "Mr. Rayburn mentioned that you'd invited him for conversation about architecture," the monk wrote. "He seemed interested but uncertain about the appropriateness of accepting. Perhaps, if he understood that you have genuine professional connection beyond gratitude for his help with your daughter, he might feel more comfortable with contact." Miranda realized that Elliot's hesitation hadn't been about pride or suspicion of her motives. He'd been protecting himself from the kind of well-meaning charity that could feel patronizing to someone who'd once possessed significant professional status. He needed to know that her interest in his knowledge was authentic, not therapeutic. She crafted another note for the shelter's bulletin board, this one explaining that she was the founder of a company that had been headquartered in the Meridian building for 3 years. She described how the building's thoughtful design had supported her during the challenging early period of establishing her business. She mentioned that she'd only recently learned the identity of the architect responsible for those design choices, and would welcome the opportunity to discuss his work from the perspective of someone who'd benefited from his expertise. The message was longer than her previous notes, but she wanted Elliot to understand that their connection went deeper than a random encounter in a park. Their professional lives had intersected years before their personal lives crossed paths through Lila's needs. As she prepared for bed that night, Miranda found herself looking at her house with new eyes, wondering what Elliot would think of its design, what insights he might offer about how the spaces could better serve her and Lila's daily routines. For the first time in years, she was genuinely curious about another person's professional perspective, rather than simply seeking to advance her own interests. The homeless man who tied her daughter's shoelaces wasn't just a kind stranger deserving of gratitude. He was a master craftsman whose work had unknowingly shaped some of the most important years of her professional development. Tomorrow, she would return to the library with a very different understanding of what their conversation might offer. To both of them, Lila's drawing covered most of her bedroom wall now, a crayon masterpiece that had grown over several days from a simple sketch into an elaborate scene. The central figure was unmistakably Elliot, rendered in the loving detail that children brought to subjects that captured their imagination. He knelt beside a small figure that was clearly Lila herself, his hands carefully positioned near her feet, where rainbow-colored shoelaces were being tied into perfect bows, but the drawing had expanded beyond that central moment to include the entire park scene. Mean-looking children with angry, scribbled faces fled from the left side of the picture, while friendly animals, rabbits, squirrels, and birds, watched approvingly from trees and bushes. A large sun shone down on the scene, and flowers bloomed in impossible profusion around the bench where the kind man worked his gentle magic. "Tell me about your picture again," Miranda said as she tucked Lila into bed, both of them admiring the artwork that had become the room's dominant feature. "Mr. Elliot has very gentle hands," Lila explained, pointing to the careful detail she'd attempted around the figure's fingers. "And he knew exactly how to make good knots that wouldn't come undone. Mama, do you think he knows how to tie other things too, like hair ribbons and apron strings?" The question revealed how thoroughly Elliot had captured her daughter's imagination. In Lila's 7-year-old worldview, someone who could tie shoelaces with such care and precision must possess all sorts of related skills. He'd become a figure of almost mythical competence in her developing understanding of how adults could help children navigate the world's challenges. "I think he probably knows how to do many helpful things," Miranda replied carefully. "He seems like someone who pays attention to details." "When are we going to see him again?" Lila asked, settling deeper into her pillows but keeping her eyes fixed on the drawing. "I want to show him my picture and ask him about buildings. Mrs. Patterson says he knows all about how buildings get made." Miranda had been dreading this question for days. Her attempts to reconnect with Elliot had become increasingly complicated as she'd learned more about his background and circumstances. The simple gratitude visit she'd originally envisioned had evolved into something much more significant, a potential relationship between two professionals whose lives had been connected in ways neither had initially understood. "I hope we'll see him soon," she said honestly. "But grown-ups sometimes need time to think about new friendships, especially when their lives are very different from each other." Lila considered this, with the seriousness she brought to adult explanations that didn't quite make sense to her. "Are you worried he won't like us?" The directness of the question caught Miranda off guard. "No, sweetheart, I think he likes you very much. But his life is complicated right now, and I want to make sure we approach our friendship in a way that feels comfortable for him, because he doesn't have a house like we do," Lila asked, demonstrating the perceptive awareness that children often possessed about adult situations, even when they didn't fully understand the implications. "That's part of it," Miranda confirmed, "but also because friendship between grown-ups can be complicated for lots of reasons that don't have anything to do with liking each other." After Lila fell asleep, Miranda stood in her home office, staring at the architectural plans she'd downloaded from the city's building permit database. The Meridian building's original blueprints showed Elliot's signature in the lower right corner, along with the careful annotations and modifications that revealed his thoughtful approach to design problems. She traced the lines of his work with her finger, remembering how those spaces had felt during her company's early years. The conference room where she'd pitched to her first major clients. The break room where she'd eaten countless meals while working late into the night. The lobby where she'd paced nervously before important meetings. All of these spaces had been shaped by Elliot's understanding of how architecture could support human activity and emotional well-being. The irony remained staggering. The man living in a homeless shelter had created the environment where she'd built a billion-dollar company. But more than irony, she was beginning to understand it as a form of debt that went far beyond simple gratitude for helping Lila. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brother Francis. "He saw your latest message. Interested in meeting but wants neutral. Ground. Suggests the library tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you're available." Miranda typed back immediately, "I'll be there. Thank you for facilitating this." The confirmation created a surge of anxiety mixed with anticipation that reminded her of the early days building her company. That combination of opportunity and uncertainty that came with high-stakes conversations that could change everything or lead nowhere. She spent the next hour researching Elliot's other projects, studying photographs of buildings he'd designed throughout his career. The body of work revealed a consistent philosophy, structures that served their users while enhancing their surroundings, buildings that aged gracefully and adapted to changing needs over time. His approach to architecture seemed guided by the same values she tried to bring to business: sustainable practices, attention to user experience, and long-term thinking that prioritized lasting value over short-term profits. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams where she was back in the Meridian building, but now it was under construction, with Elliot directing workers and making adjustments to plans while she tried to explain how grateful she was for spaces she hadn't yet learned to appreciate. The next morning brought its usual rush of meetings and decisions, but Miranda found her attention divided between quarterly projections and thoughts about the afternoon's conversation. She'd built her career on preparation and strategic thinking, but this meeting defied normal business planning. How do you prepare to thank someone for unknowingly shaping your professional success while they were creating the foundation for their own eventual downfall? At lunch, she called her father's former colleague, Dr. Michael Ross, who'd known her family during her childhood in Cleveland. Her father had often spoken about the importance of approaching people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances, and she needed wisdom from someone who'd shared those values. Daddy always said that treating people with respect wasn't about their situation, it was about who you choose to be, she told Dr. Ross over the phone. "But I'm worried about getting this wrong, about making things harder for someone who's already dealing with so much." Dr. Ross listened patiently as she explained the situation, the remarkable coincidence of Elliot's role in her company's history and her uncertainty about how to approach their meeting. "Your father would tell you to trust the same instincts that made you want to find this man in the first place," Dr. Ross said finally. "You recognized quality in how he treated Lila. Trust that same recognition when you talk with him about his work. Genuine appreciation isn't charity, Miranda. It's acknowledgement of value that already exists." The advice resonated with her approach to business relationships. Focus on mutual benefit and authentic respect rather than trying to manufacture outcomes through manipulation or excessive courtesy. At 1:30, Miranda arrived at the library, early, choosing a table in the architecture section where she could watch for Elliot's arrival. She'd brought printouts of the Meridian building plans and several articles about sustainable design that might provide natural conversation starters if their interaction felt awkward. But mostly, she'd brought Lila's drawing, carefully folded. In her purse, something about her daughter's innocent artwork seemed like the most honest representation of what Elliot's kindness had meant to their family. At exactly 2 o'clock, she saw him enter the section with the same careful bearing she remembered from their previous encounter. He'd clearly taken extra care with his appearance. His clothes were clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed, his posture reflecting the professional dignity he'd maintained despite his circumstances. Their eyes met across the reading area, and he approached with measured steps that suggested both nervous anticipation and determined resolve. "Hello, Miranda," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. "I understand you've learned something about my background." The directness of his opening surprised her, though she realized it reflected the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned to address difficult topics rather than dancing around them. Street life had apparently taught him to value efficiency in personal interactions. "I have," she replied, meeting his directness with her own. "And I owe you a debt that goes far beyond gratitude for helping Lila." She spread the Meridian building, blueprints on the table between them, watching his expression as he recognized his own work from years past. His fingers moved automatically toward the plans, then stopped, as if seeking permission to touch memories made tangible. "You can look at them," she said softly. "They're your designs." Elliot's hands moved over the familiar lines with the gentle precision she remembered from watching him tie Lila's shoelaces. But now she understood that this care with details represented decades of professional practice, not just personal kindness. "I spent 3 years in this building," Miranda continued, "from 2019 to 2022, while I was building my company. I never knew the architect's name, but I remember how the spaces made me feel. Supported, focused, like the building itself was helping me succeed." Elliot looked up from the blueprints with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from learning your work had served its intended purpose. "That was the goal," he said quietly. "Buildings should enhance human potential, not just provide shelter." "You succeeded," Miranda replied. "More than you know. My company might not exist without the environment you created. You helped me build something lasting, even though we'd never met." The conversation hung suspended between them, weighted with implications neither had fully processed yet. Miranda reached into her purse and carefully unfolded Lila's drawing, spreading it beside the architectural plans. "She wanted you to see this," Miranda said, "her version of what happened in the park." Elliot studied the child's artwork with the same attention he'd given to his professional blueprints, but his expression softened in ways that suggested Lila's crayon interpretation of their encounter might mean more to him than architectural recognition. "She has quite an imagination," he said, his voice carrying warmth that had been absent when discussing his professional work. "Though I think she's made me look rather more heroic than reality would suggest." "Children see truth that adults sometimes miss," Miranda replied. "Maybe her version is more accurate than you think." Elliot's silver drafting pen had survived. Everything, the collapse of his firm, the loss of his home, 4 years of homelessness. The cross-century too had been a gift from Margaret on their 20th wedding anniversary, engraved with his initials in script lettering that had worn smooth from years of use. It was the one possession he'd refused to sell even when he desperately needed money for food or shelter fees. Now, as he held Lila's drawing in one hand and the familiar weight of his pen in the other, memories flooded back of all the times he'd used this same instrument to sketch ideas, sign contracts, and create the detailed drawings that had defined his career. The pen had touched paper to birth buildings that still stood throughout the city, had signed paychecks for dozens of employees, had marked the plans for structures that would outlive everyone in this library. "Would you mind if I added something to Lila's picture?" he asked Miranda, gesturing toward the drawing with his pen. "Nothing that would change her vision, just a small detail she might appreciate." Miranda nodded, curious about what he had in mind. She watched as Elliot studied the child's artwork with the same careful attention he'd once brought to million-dollar construction projects, looking for the right place to make his addition without overwhelming her creative expression. In the corner of the paper, where Lila had drawn a simple park bench, Elliot began sketching with precise, economical lines. His architect's training showed in the way he could suggest 3-dimensional forms with minimal strokes, creating depth and perspective that transformed Lila's flat representation into something more architecturally sophisticated while maintaining the innocent charm of her original concept. But what he drew wasn't just a bench. It was their bench. The specific weathered seat where they'd first encountered each other, complete with the small details that marked it as a particular place, rather than a generic piece of park furniture. The worn armrest where countless hands had rested, the small crack in one of the back slats, the way the metal supports had settled slightly into the earth over decades of use. "You have an extraordinary eye for detail," Miranda observed, watching his skilled hands work. "Even in something as simple as this drawing, you're thinking about how the structure relates to its environment." "Architecture is about relationships," Elliot replied, without looking up from his sketching. "How buildings connect to their sites, how spaces flow into each other, how human beings move through and use the environments we create. Even a park bench has to fit properly into its context to serve its purpose well." As he worked, adding subtle shading that gave weight and substance to the bench, Miranda found herself remembering specific moments from her time in the Meridian building. The way afternoon light had streamed through the windows of her first office, creating warm pools of illumination that had made even the longest workdays feel manageable. The elevator bank that had been positioned to create natural gathering spaces where chance encounters between tenants led to business collaborations. The lobby design that had made her feel professional and confident even when her company was barely more than an ambitious idea. "The Meridian building," she said quietly. "The way you positioned the elevator bank to create those informal meeting areas. Was that intentional?" Elliot looked up from the drawing, surprised by the specific nature of her observation. "You noticed that? I lived it," Miranda replied. "Some of my most important early partnerships started with conversations in that lobby. I always thought it was lucky coincidence, but now I realize it was deliberate design." A smile crossed Elliot's weathered face, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "One of my proudest achievements in that building was creating spaces for serendipity, places where people would naturally pause and interact, where business relationships could develop organically instead of being forced." "It worked better than you could have imagined," Miranda said. "I met my first major client in that lobby. A chance conversation while we were both waiting for elevators led to a contract that kept my company alive during our first year." The revelation seemed to energize something in Elliot that had been dormant since their conversation began. His posture straightened slightly, his voice carried more conviction, and his movements became more animated as he described the philosophy behind his design choices. "Commercial architecture often treats human interaction as an afterthought," he explained, returning to work on Lila's drawing while he talked. "Architects focus on maximizing rentable square footage or creating impressive visual statements, but they forget that buildings exist to support the activities that happen inside them." "You didn't forget," Miranda said. "Every space in that building felt intentional, like someone had thought carefully about how people would actually use it." Elliot finished his addition to the drawing and set down his pen, studying the result with quiet satisfaction. The bench now seemed to anchor the entire scene, giving Lila's imaginative artwork a solid foundation that enhanced rather than overwhelming her creative vision. "She'll love this," Miranda said, examining the subtle enhancement he'd made. "But more than that, she'll love knowing that you cared enough about her picture to add something special to it." The comment seemed to catch Elliot off guard, as if the idea that his professional skills might bring joy to a 7-year-old hadn't occurred to him. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something vulnerable beneath the dignified surface he'd maintained throughout their conversation. The faded family photograph in Elliot's wallet showed 3 people who'd once believed their happiness was permanent. Sarah at 16, grinning beside her parents at her high school graduation, all of them dressed in their finest clothes and radiating the confidence that came from successful lives built on solid foundations. Margaret had organized the photo session to commemorate Sarah's achievement and their family's bright future, back when futures seemed predictable and prosperity felt earned rather than fragile. Now the photograph served as both treasure and torment, a reminder of what love looked like when it wasn't tested by catastrophic loss. Elliot had carried it through every day of homelessness, through the divorce proceedings and Sarah's gradual withdrawal from his life, through the countless nights when he'd wondered if maintaining hope was simply another form of self-torture. "I used to have a family," he said quietly, pulling the photograph from his wallet and placing it on the table beside Lila's drawing and the architectural plans. "This was taken 8 years ago, before everything changed." Miranda studied the image with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was being trusted with something precious and painful. The man in the photograph bore only passing resemblance to the person sitting across from her. Same bone structure, same gentle eyes, but filled with the unconscious confidence of someone whose world made sense. "Your daughter looks like she adores you," Miranda observed, noting the way teenage Sarah leaned into her father's embrace, their shared smile suggesting genuine affection rather than posed courtesy. "She did," Elliot replied, his voice carrying the weight of past tense. "But watching your father lose everything he'd built, his business, his home, his ability to provide for his family, that's harder for a young person to understand than simple divorce or death. Sarah couldn't reconcile the successful man who'd raised her with the failure I became." The pain in his voice was so raw that Miranda found herself wanting to argue with his self-assessment, to challenge the narrative of failure he'd constructed around his circumstances. But she recognized that contradicting someone's understanding of their own experience, however flawed, would feel dismissive rather than supportive. "What happened when your business closed?" she asked instead, hoping to understand the full scope of his loss. Elliot's fingers moved automatically to the architectural plans, tracing the familiar lines as he spoke. "I used every asset I had, my home, Margaret's inheritance, our retirement savings, to pay severance packages for my employees and honor existing contracts with clients. I thought I was doing the honorable thing, taking responsibility for the people who'd trusted me with their careers and projects." "You were," Miranda said firmly. "That was exactly the honorable thing." "Honor doesn't pay rent," Elliot replied with bitter accuracy. "Margaret tried to be supportive at first, but she'd built her sense of security around our financial stability. Watching that disappear, while I insisted on paying other people instead of protecting our own future, she couldn't understand why I was choosing strangers over my own family." The story emerged in careful, measured sentences that suggested he'd told it to himself many times, trying to make sense of decisions that had felt necessary in the moment but catastrophic in retrospect. The lawsuit from a previous project had drained his insurance coverage and professional reputation simultaneously. The economic downturn had frozen construction financing just as his firm was positioned for its largest expansion. Personal guarantees on business loans had made his private assets vulnerable to corporate debts. Each individual decision had seemed reasonable when made, but their cumulative effect had been the complete destruction of a life built over decades of careful planning and hard work. "Sarah was starting college when the worst of it hit," Elliot continued, his voice growing quieter as he approached the most painful parts of his story. "She'd been accepted to Northwestern, full tuition, and suddenly I couldn't contribute anything to her expenses. She had to take out loans, work part-time, live in the cheapest housing available. Her friends' parents were paying for study abroad programs and unpaid internships while she was struggling to afford textbooks." Miranda could imagine the shame a proud father would feel, watching his daughter's opportunities diminish because of his inability to provide support. The photograph showed a man who'd clearly taken pleasure in his role as provider and protector. Losing that identity would have been devastating, beyond simple financial hardship. "When did you last talk to her?" Miranda asked gently. Elliot was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally answered, his voice was barely audible. 18 months ago. She called to tell me she was getting married. Said she'd thought about inviting me, but she didn't. Want to explain to her fiancé's family why her father was—" He gestured at his worn clothes, unable to finish the sentence. The cruelty of that rejection, being excluded from his daughter's wedding, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because of circumstances beyond his control, struck Miranda as particularly heartbreaking. She found herself thinking of Leela, trying to imagine any scenario where she would be ashamed to have her daughter meet her father. "She's young," Miranda said finally. "Young people sometimes prioritize appearance over character. That might change as she matures." "Perhaps," Elliot replied, though his tone suggested he'd long since stopped hoping for reconciliation. "But I understand her choice. She's building a new life with someone who can provide security and stability. Having a homeless father would complicate that narrative in ways she shouldn't have to manage." The photograph remained on the table between them, a silent testimony to love that had once felt unshakable, but had proven vulnerable to forces neither parent nor child had anticipated or prepared for. The new blueprint, spread across Elliot's drafting table, was unlike anything he'd designed during his commercial career. The Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center would serve the city's homeless population with dignity and practical efficiency. Overnight shelter space that felt like temporary housing rather than institutional warehousing, meeting rooms where job training and counseling could happen in environments that respected the humanity of people seeking help, and a central courtyard that would provide green space and natural light to visitors who might have limited access to either. 6 months had passed since his conversation with Miranda at the library, months that had transformed his life in ways he was still processing. The transition from Sacred Heart Shelter to his small but comfortable apartment had been jarring in the most wonderful way. Privacy, his own bathroom, a kitchen where he could prepare simple meals instead of depending entirely on donated food. But more significant than the physical improvements was the restoration of purpose that came with meaningful work. Miranda had approached their developing friendship with the same strategic thinking she brought to business relationships, but tempered with genuine respect for his autonomy and circumstances. Instead of offering charity disguised as opportunity, she'd created actual opportunity that utilized his expertise while allowing him to maintain his dignity. The community center project had emerged from their discussions about architecture's social responsibilities, a chance for Elliot to design spaces that addressed problems he now understood from personal experience. "The courtyard design is brilliant," said James Morrison, the city planning director, who'd initially been skeptical about hiring a formerly homeless architect for such a visible public project. "The way you've positioned the seating areas to create both community gathering spaces and private retreat areas, it shows understanding that goes beyond theoretical knowledge." Elliot nodded his thanks while continuing to study the drawings. Every detail of the design reflected lessons learned during his months on the street. The importance of sightlines that allowed people to feel secure while maintaining privacy. The need for multiple entrance and exit points to prevent anyone from feeling trapped. The value of spaces that could serve different functions throughout the day to maximize utility. Working with Morrison's planning team had required all of Elliot's diplomatic skills, refined through decades of managing client relationships and construction teams. Some city officials had questioned the wisdom of employing an architect whose previous firm had failed, while others had been curious about how his recent experiences might inform his approach to designing social services facilities. Elliot had addressed both concerns with patient professionalism, letting his detailed knowledge and thoughtful design solutions demonstrate his competence more effectively than arguments about his qualifications could have managed. The project's Funding had come through Hargrove Technologies' charitable foundation, but Miranda had been careful to structure the arrangement as a standard architectural commission rather than philanthropic gesture. Elliot was being paid market rates for professional services, allowing him to re-establish his credentials while contributing to his own recovery from financial catastrophe. The community input sessions have been remarkable, Morrison continued, reviewing the notes from meetings where current and former homeless individuals had provided feedback on the preliminary designs. I've never seen a public project where the intended users felt so genuinely heard and respected. Those sessions had been Elliot's idea, born from his recognition that architectural expertise needed to be balanced with experiential knowledge from people who understood homelessness from the inside. Marcus had served as liaison between the design team and the broader homeless community, helping to ensure that theoretical solutions addressed practical realities. The veteran's insights had proven invaluable, his suggestions about storage solutions, security concerns, and the psychological impact of different spatial arrangements had influenced major design decisions. More importantly, his endorsement had convinced other shelter residents that this was a genuine attempt to create better services rather than another well-intentioned project that would overlook their actual needs. "When do we break ground?" Elliot asked, though he already knew the timeline from their previous meetings. 3 months, Morrison replied. And the City Council has been so impressed with the community engagement process that they're asking about applying the same approach to other social services projects. This could be the beginning of a much larger collaboration. The possibility of additional work felt simultaneously exciting and daunting. Elliot's confidence in his professional abilities had returned gradually, supported by the positive response to his designs and the smooth working relationship with city planners. But he remained cautious about expanding his commitments too quickly, aware that his circumstances could change again, despite recent improvements. That evening, Elliot walked through Riverside Park on his way home from the planning office, passing the bench where he'd first encountered Lila 7 months earlier. The worn wooden seat looked exactly the same, but his perspective on it had shifted dramatically. What had once been a place to rest during long days of jobless wandering now served as a landmark of connection, the spot where his life had begun, to change through the simple act of helping a child in distress. Lila had visited his apartment the previous weekend, bringing her completed drawing, now framed and hanging in his small living room, and a dozen new questions about architecture and building design. Her curiosity reminded him of Sarah at the same age, endlessly fascinated by how things worked and why they were designed the way they were. But unlike his memories of his daughter, these interactions carried no weight of obligation or expectation, just the pure pleasure of sharing knowledge with someone eager to learn. Miranda had been careful to avoid any suggestion that their friendship obligated him to serve as a substitute father figure for Lila, but their relationship had evolved naturally into something resembling extended family. The little girl called him Uncle Elliot now, a title that carried more warmth and acceptance than most of his professional achievements had provided. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. "Dad, I saw the article about your community center project in the Tribune. I'm proud of you. Can we talk? Love, Sarah." Elliot read the message 3 times before the words fully registered. His daughter had found him, had learned about his recovery and new work, had chosen to reach out despite the painful history between them. The possibility of reconciliation, something he'd forced himself to stop hoping for, suddenly felt real. Again, he composed his reply carefully. "I would love to talk with you. I think about you every day and hope you're happy. When would be good for you?" The response came within minutes. "Tomorrow? I'm in the city for work. Coffee at 2 p.m., the place near Northwestern where we used to meet when I was in college." As Elliot confirmed the meeting, he realized that the bench where he now sat had witnessed the beginning of more than just his friendship with Lila and Miranda. It had been the catalyst for a series of changes that had returned his life to him. Not the same life he'd lost, but something new and perhaps more meaningful for having been rebuilt from nothing through the power of human connection and the decision to maintain dignity even in the darkest circumstances. Tomorrow he would see his daughter for the first time in 18 months, no longer as a failed father seeking her forgiveness, but as a man who'd found his way back to purpose and contribution despite devastating setbacks. The community center blueprint in his bag represented more than professional rehabilitation. It was proof that loss didn't have to be permanent, that starting over was possible at any age, and that the kindness shown to one child could ripple outward to transform multiple lives in ways no one could have predicted.